Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel, and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
In the rolling hills of Sicily, where the olive groves twist in the sun and the wind carries with it the smell of earth and stone, there lies a farmhouse. Its walls are faded by time, its shutters drawn against the outside world. To the casual passerby, it seems unremarkable, another fragment of the Sicilian countryside left to the stillness of age. Yet behind those shuttered windows, history itself was being shaped by a man who preferred silence over spectacle, invisibility over fame. Inside, the air is heavy with dust and secrecy. A small wooden table holds a battered typewriter, the keys worn from years of use. The sound of tapping fills the dimly lit room, slow and deliberate. Each keystroke forms not a simple letter but a coded fragment, a message meant to travel through loyal hands across the island. The old man hunched over the machine does not look like a figure of fear. His face is plain, lined with age, unremarkable in every way. And yet this man is Bernardo Provenzano, the ghost of Cosa Nostra. For more than 4 decades, he ruled the Sicilian Mafia in near total invisibility. To some, he was a rumor whispered in prison cells and backroom meetings, a myth that drifted across the mountains. To others, he was a guiding hand, unseen but always present, shaping the destiny of Sicily's most secretive brotherhood. Even within his own ranks, there were those who doubted whether he still lived. His absence was so complete, so consuming, that he seemed less like a man and more like a specter haunting the island. To understand the paradox of Bernardo Provenzano, one must begin with this image, an unremarkable figure who carried an empire on his shoulders, a man who moved entire cities with nothing more than silence and paper. Where others chose to dominate with fire and blood, he chose to vanish. His power lay in restraint, in patience, in the art of waiting until time itself surrendered. Flash forward to April 11, 2006. The sun hung high over Sicily, casting gold across the hills. Police helicopters circled above, and officers in black moved carefully through the countryside. Their destination was this very farmhouse, a place so ordinary it had long been overlooked. When the doors were forced open, the men inside expected resistance, perhaps violence, perhaps death. Instead, they found an old man seated calmly beside his typewriter. His hair was white, his body frail. His eyes, however, carried the same quiet calculation that had outwitted governments, journalists, and rival bosses for over 40 years. This was the moment the myth dissolved into flesh. The ghost had been captured. For the world, it was an ending. For Sicily, a revelation. Yet for Provenzano himself, it was merely the quiet inevitability of time. He had always known that ghosts cannot remain invisible forever. But before that farmhouse, before the typewriter, before the frailty of age, there was the making of a phantom. Bernardo Provenzano was not born into legend. He was born into silence. The silence of rural Sicily, where the soil was red with memory and the mountains guarded their secrets with indifference. He grew up among the citrus groves and narrow alleys of Corleone, a town whose name would one day echo across the world as the heart of the Mafia. Yet as a boy, Provenzano was unremarkable, quiet, withdrawn, almost awkward. His ordinariness was his camouflage, a cloak that would later make him invisible to enemies and authorities alike. The Mafia thrives on contradictions. It is a brotherhood of loyalty built on betrayal, a family that devours its own, a world where silence speaks louder than words. In such a place, Provenzano was not destined to dazzle or to roar. He was destined to endure, Where others sought glory, he sought shadows. Where others courted fear, he let fear come naturally, not from violence but from absence. This chapter is an invitation into that paradox, into the labyrinth of a man who commanded armies but never stood on a stage, who shaped history yet left barely a photograph behind. His nickname was Binu Trattori, the Tractor, because when ordered to eliminate rivals, he plowed through without hesitation. And yet, unlike other mafia bosses, his name was rarely spoken outside hushed circles. He became something greater than a man. He became uncertainty itself. What does it mean to live as a ghost while still alive? To walk through the world leaving only whispers, to sit in a farmhouse shaping empires while the outside world wonders if you even exist. Provenzano's life offers not answers but echoes. His power was not in the violence he ordered, though it was vast. His power was in silence. Silence that suffocated, silence that commanded, silence that endured longer than fire. As you step into this story, imagine the sound of that farmhouse room, the typewriter's steady tapping, the low hum of the countryside, the heartbeat of a man who had mastered invisibility. It is here, in this quiet beginning, that the legend of the ghost of Cosa Nostra comes alive. But this is only the surface. Behind the shuttered windows lies a journey into the roots of Sicilian blood and soil, into the rise of the Corleone, into years of terror and silence. Each chapter ahead unfolds not only the history of a man, but the anatomy of fear, patience, and invisibility itself. And so, the story begins with a ghost who was once a boy from Corleone, a ghost who became an empire, a ghost who would outlast nearly all who tried to hunt him. By the time you reach the end, you may find yourself asking not how such a man lived, but how such silence could ever hold so much power. For now, we leave the farmhouse as the police lead him away, frail yet unbroken, his typewriter abandoned at the table. Outside, the Sicilian sun burns the hills gold. The ghost has been revealed, but to understand him, we must return to where it all began. Corleone. Even the name carries the weight of legend. For most of the world, it is a word that belongs to cinema, forever linked to the dark myth of the Godfather. But long before Hollywood turned it into a symbol, Corleone was a real place, harsh, isolated, and shaped by poverty. In the 1930s and 40s, it was not a glamorous underworld but a poor farming town, where men's backs bent under the sun and the land yielded as grudgingly as the people. The roads were narrow, cracked with dust in summer and turned to mud in winter. Stone houses, tightly packed, bore shutters that seemed permanently closed, as though guarding secrets no one dared to name aloud. The air carried the scent of citrus groves and olive trees, mixed with the heavy musk of soil freshly plowed by calloused hands. At dawn, the bells of the church rang out, summoning villagers to mass, their footsteps echoing in the silence of streets where vendettas could stretch across generations. It was in this world that Bernardo Provenzano was born in 1933. His family was poor. Peasants with little beyond the stubborn pride of survival. He grew up without luxury, without prospects, and without the illusion of choice. In Corleone, the mafia was not an option one might weigh, like a career path. It was an inheritance written into the soil itself, a system older than the Italian state, as natural as the changing seasons. The boy who would one day be known as Binu did not stand out. He was not charismatic, not bold. To neighbors, he was quiet, sometimes awkward, a child who blended into the background. But even in his ordinariness, something was forming. An instinct for silence, for watchfulness, for letting others reveal themselves while he absorbed every detail. Among his childhood companions was another boy from Corleone, Salvatore Riina. Unlike Bernardo, Riina's presence demanded attention. Stockier, more forceful, Riina carried himself with a kind of blunt aggression even as a youth. Where Provenzano seemed to dissolve into the crowd, Riina pushed against it. Together, though, they would grow into something larger than themselves, two sides of the same coin that would later dominate the mafia's bloody history. The boys grew up in a Sicily where violence was ordinary, woven into daily existence. The fascist regime had tried to suppress the mafia, sending in police and prefects to crush its influence. But repression only pushed the organization deeper underground, where its codes and rituals remained intact. By the time the Second World War ended and chaos spread across the island, the mafia returned stronger, its roots nourished by the instability. Young Provenzano and Riina absorbed lessons not from classrooms but from watching the older men around them. A quarrel over land might end with a body in a ditch. A careless insult could mean disappearance. They learned early that silence was protection, that words could be as dangerous as weapons. Loyalty was survival, and ruthlessness, delivered without hesitation, was the only true form of justice in Corleone. The older mafiosi, hardened by decades of vendetta, took notice of these boys. They saw in them pliable clay, ready to be shaped by the unwritten laws of Cosa Nostra. Provenzano's quietness, which outsiders might have mistaken for weakness, was in fact his greatest shield. He was not flamboyant like the gangster figures sung about in ballads. He did not boast, did not swagger. His invisibility made him useful. While others drew attention, he simply endured, unnoticed, patient, like a shadow that never left the wall. Life in Corleone was marked by paradox. Families prayed in the church, knelt before icons of the Madonna, and taught their children reverence for God. Yet outside the chapel walls, disputes were settled not by forgiveness but by blood. The Catholic rituals offered comfort, but the true religion was silence, omerta. To break it was unthinkable, a betrayal not just of men but of the land itself. For Provenzano, childhood was not a gentle prelude but a slow initiation. He saw how men disappeared after nightfall, how the air carried whispers of names no one dared speak aloud. He witnessed funerals where faces were dry, no tears shed, because grief was weakness and weakness invited danger. Violence was not extraordinary, it was as common as the changing of crops. The bond between Provenzano and Riina deepened as they matured. They were inseparable not because they were alike, but because each filled a space the other lacked. Riina was the fist, Provenzano the whisper. Riina radiated menace, Provenzano dissolved into silence. Together, they balanced power and caution, force and invisibility. In the years ahead, that partnership would shake Sicily to its core. Yet in these early days, there was no prophecy carved into stone. They were simply boys in a poor town, sons of peasants who looked for a way out of poverty. The path before them was not paved with gold, but with fear, secrecy, and the strange respect reserved for those who could kill without hesitation, and then walk calmly to church the next morning. What made Provenzano unique was not ambition or charisma, it was inevitability. He seemed to accept from a young age that his life would not follow the path of books or trades. He belonged to the soil of Corleone, and the soil demanded silence, loyalty, and blood. He did not seek power with fire but with patience. And patience, in a world so accustomed to violence, could be more dangerous than rage. By the late 1940s, the boys of Corleone were no longer simply witnesses. They were ready to step across the invisible threshold that separated ordinary villagers from the men of honor. Their childhoods had been shaped by scarcity, their adolescence by whispers of vendettas, and their young adulthood by the presence of men who lived outside the law, yet ruled within it. When Provenzano walked the streets of his village, there was little to distinguish him from any other farmhand's son. He did not dress lavishly, did not draw attention. He carried himself as though he were invisible, and in a sense he was. But behind the stillness, a future was forming, a future where invisibility would become his greatest weapon. As dusk fell over Corleone, the church bells would toll once more, echoing across fields where boys once played and men once killed. Shadows lengthened over the groves, and in the silence of the countryside, destiny stirred. Provenzano was no longer just a boy from a forgotten town. He was becoming something else, something the soil itself seemed to produce, as though the land conspired to shape him into a man who would rule not with spectacle, but with shadows. And in those shadows, the story of his rise was only beginning. Sicily in the late 1960s was a place where old codes of honor were beginning to fray, and something darker, sharper, more merciless was taking root. The mafia was no longer just a network of rural families managing citrus groves, labor contracts, and quiet smuggling routes. It was transforming into an empire of heroin pipelines, political infiltration, and international money flows. And at the center of that transformation was a small, unremarkable town, Corleone, whose sons were about to seize control of all of Cosa Nostra. The Corleonesi were outsiders in many ways. Palermo's mafia bosses, with their ties to aristocrats and businessmen, looked down on the men from Corleone as peasants. They were seen as rough, unsophisticated, too eager to spill blood. But behind that stereotype lay a terrible advantage. For men like Salvatore Toto, Riina, and Bernardo Provenzano, violence was not a performance. It was a language they had spoken since childhood, a rhythm as natural as planting wheat or pruning olive trees. Provenzano was not the kind of man to stand at the center of a crowd and command loyalty through charisma. He was quiet, withdrawn, and often avoided direct eye contact. But where Riina was fire, loud, brash, unrelenting, Provenzano was ice. He calculated, waited, and pulled strings with a patience that seemed endless. Together, they became something Sicily had never seen before. A partnership where one man's fury and another man's silence fused into a weapon capable of reshaping the mafia itself. The 1970s brought a storm of killings that would come to be known as the Mafia Wars. Streets of Palermo echoed with the sound of gunfire and car bombs. Old bosses, men who had once believed themselves untouchable, were ambushed in daylight, dragged from their homes, or simply vanished. Entire families were uprooted. Some were slaughtered in their beds, others were erased so cleanly that only silence remained. And behind that campaign of erasure stood the Corleonesi. Riina played the part of executioner, orchestrating killings with a taste for spectacle. His enemies were left in pools of blood, their deaths meant to terrify anyone who dared resist. But Provenzano preferred another method. He earned the nickname Binu U Trattori, the tractor. The phrase came not from noisy theatrics, but from his relentless efficiency. He rolled over opponents like heavy machinery, leaving nothing behind but destruction. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need recognition. What mattered was that the Corleonesi advanced, step by step, until no one else remained standing. Palermo, once ruled by men who dined with politicians and businessmen, was suddenly consumed by whispers. In back kitchens, women lowered their voices, telling each other which neighbor had gone missing. Children grew up knowing which alleyways to avoid at night. Priests muttered funeral prayers for men whose bodies were never found. Fear became the air people breathed. Yet Provenzano remained invisible. Even as bodies piled up, few outside the inner circle could have picked him out of a crowd. His face was not on the front pages. His name was barely spoken aloud. And that was his genius. Riina made himself feared. Provenzano made himself forgotten. He knew that power did not belong to those who stood in the spotlight, but to those who could move pieces quietly unseen. By the mid-1970s, the Corleonesi had achieved something unthinkable. They were no longer just peasants from the countryside. They were reshaping the very structure of Cosa Nostra. Families that had once sneered at them were bent to their will or wiped from existence. The old guard, with their codes of restraint, were gone. What replaced them was an empire built on paranoia and absolute loyalty. Still, Provenzano never allowed himself to be defined only by blood. To outsiders, he seemed dull, almost disappointingly ordinary. He wore simple clothes. He rarely raised his voice. He lived in houses that appeared modest compared to the riches flowing into mafia coffers. This ordinariness was his camouflage. While Riina's brutality drew attention from police, journalists, and politicians, Provenzano slipped into the background, unnoticed. He was a man hiding in plain sight, pulling threads that others could not even see. And it was this duality, the loud brutality of Riina and the quiet strategy of Provenzano, that made the Corleonesi unstoppable. Each killing tightened the noose. Each disappearance sent shockwaves through communities. Each silence, carefully maintained, became a weapon more powerful than bullets. By the decade's close, Sicily was suffocating under their grip. Politicians avoided eye contact in public. Judges hesitated before signing warrants. Ordinary families whispered at dinner tables, wondering if tomorrow would bring another explosion. The Corleone were no longer merely contenders in a fractured landscape. They had become the storm itself. And in the eye of that storm stood Bernardo Provenzano, quiet, patient, invisible, yet more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The 1980s arrived in Sicily with the same sun-bleached days and salt-heavy breezes that had always lingered on the island. The orange grove swayed in the wind, the church bells rang at dusk, and families gathered in courtyards with plates of pasta and bread. Outwardly, life seemed untouched, timeless. Yet beneath the surface, the island quivered with fear. Shadows moved differently. Whispers hung heavier in the air. Sicily was entering one of the darkest passages in its modern history. At the center of it all stood the Corleone, and within that faction, two men whose names would be forever linked to terror: Salvatore Toto Riina and his quiet strategist, Bernardo Provenzano. Riina relished violence. He was direct, merciless, an executioner who bathed the streets in blood to send messages no one could ignore. Provenzano, by contrast, rarely left a fingerprint. He guided from behind curtains, his voice carried only to those closest to him. If Riina was the thunder, Provenzano was the silence before the storm, the silence that made the explosion all the more unbearable. The war against the state began not as a declaration, but as a pattern. Journalists who asked the wrong questions were gunned down in their cars. Police officers who pressed too close were ambushed on narrow roads. Politicians who dared to show integrity found themselves marked. To the Corleone, the state was not untouchable. It was prey, like any rival family. The pace of killings quickened, echoing like drumbeats across Sicily. Car bombs became a language. Each blast spoke of warning, dominance, inevitability. Palermo, a city once proud of its Baroque palaces and sunlit piazzas, became a stage for fear. Mothers hurried their children indoors before nightfall. Shopkeepers swept their doorways with eyes that never truly looked up. And all the while, Provenzano's hand steered the wheel. He had no love for spectacle. In truth, he distrusted Riina's appetite for blood. But he understood its utility. The killings drew attention, yes, but they also eliminated obstacles, silenced voices, and bought time for deeper maneuvers. Provenzano was already thinking years ahead, imagining a mafia that would not just dominate Sicily, but outlive this storm by burrowing back into the shadows once the violence had spent itself. The killings escalated until they touched something sacred: the judiciary. Giovanni Falcone, a magistrate with the calm persistence of a craftsman, had dedicated his life to dismantling Cosa Nostra. He followed trails of money with the patience of a gardener pulling weeds, tracing roots deep into the soil. Falcone's colleague, Paolo Borsellino, stood beside him, another figure of rare courage. Together, they represented a possibility Sicily had almost forgotten: that justice, though fragile, could still stand. For Riina and Provenzano, such men were intolerable. Falcone had to die. On a bright May afternoon in 1992, Falcone's convoy traveled along the coastal highway near Capaci. The sea shimmered beside the road, deceptively calm. Beneath the asphalt lay half a ton of explosives. At a signal, the earth itself erupted. The blast hurled cars into the air, shattering glass, ripping open steel. Falcone, his wife, and 3 bodyguards were killed. The echo of the explosion carried far beyond Sicily. It reverberated through Italy, through Europe, through the conscience of the world. 2 months later, Borsellino met a similar fate. Returning to his mother's home in Palermo, he stepped from his car into an inferno of fire and debris. The bomb left little but wreckage, and with it, a city plunged deeper into mourning. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino became more than tragedies. They became symbols of an assault not just on individuals, but on the very possibility of law, of democracy, of hope. Ordinary Italians, shopkeepers, students, priests, flooded the streets in grief. White sheets were hung from balconies as silent protests, banners of resistance against the suffocating reign of fear. The contrast could not have been sharper, the gentle rhythm of waves on the Sicilian coast, and the thunder of explosions tearing through that serenity. It was as though the island itself were caught between its eternal beauty and its human despair. Through it all, Provenzano remained unseen. His fingerprints were not on the detonators. His name did not appear in police files beside the bombs, but those who looked closely recognized the shadow. He had advised restraint when Riina wanted more blood, argued for patience when Riina sought frenzy. Provenzano was the counterweight, ensuring the Mafia's survival even as Riina dragged it into open war. Yet restraint, in Provenzano's terms, was relative. He was no savior, no moderating angel. His vision was pragmatic, not merciful. He understood that violence was a tool, but not the only tool. Too much of it, and the state would awaken with a vengeance. Too little, and rivals would seize advantage. His genius lay in calibration, pulling back just enough to ensure that when the fire burned hottest, something of the organization would remain intact. The cost was incalculable. Across Sicily, families mourned fathers who never came home, sons who never grew old, daughters who were silenced too soon. Fear settled like ash after an eruption, clinging to the skin of daily life. Children grew up believing that sudden death was as natural as the summer cicadas. But alongside grief, something else was stirring. Citizens, weary of silence, began to lift their voices. Marches filled the streets, candles lit the nights. Mothers carried photographs of lost sons. Schoolchildren held banners painted with words of defiance. The Mafia had sown terror, but had also planted seeds of resistance it could not entirely control. By the early 1990s, Riina's excesses had pushed the war past its breaking point. The state could no longer pretend blindness. The hunt for the Mafia intensified. Helicopters circled the hills. Special units moved into Palermo. Politicians who had once turned their faces away now spoke of duty, of cleansing. In the midst of this tightening noose, Provenzano began to transform. He understood what Riina did not, that the age of open slaughter was ending. For the Mafia to endure, it would need a ghost, not a butcher. It would need a man who could lead without being seen, who could erase himself from photographs and memories, leaving only traces of orders carried on scraps of paper. As Riina's downfall loomed, Provenzano's rise into true invisibility was only beginning. The years of terror had left Sicily scarred, but they had also left it changed. And in those scars, the shadow of Bernardo Provenzano lengthened, quiet, patient, implacable. When Salvatore Toto, Riina, was finally captured in 1993, after decades of blood and fire, many in Sicily believed the nightmare had ended. The boss of bosses had ruled like a tyrant, turning Palermo into a theater of terror where judges, generals, and journalists were struck down in open defiance of the state. His reign was defined by noise, the roar of car bombs, the thunder of gunfire in narrow streets, the screams of a nation brought to its knees. And so, when he was led away in handcuffs, the people whispered a fragile hope. Perhaps the Mafia had been broken at last. But the Mafia is not a man. It is a shadow, a shape that shifts when one figure falls. And from the silence left in Riina's wake, another presence emerged, quieter, colder, infinitely more patient. His name was Bernardo Provenzano. Unlike Riina, Provenzano had no taste for spectacle. He despised the recklessness of bombs and the chaos of blood spilled in daylight. Where Riina had made himself infamous, Provenzano made himself invisible. The very qualities that had once made him appear weak within Cosa Nostra, his reserve, his silence, his almost monastic way of living, became the perfect tools for reshaping the organization. He inherited not a mafia in triumph, but a mafia in retreat. The massacres of the 1980s and early 1990s had provoked an unprecedented response from the Italian state. Police raids shook villages, prosecutors demanded maximum sentences, and entire neighborhoods turned into watchtowers of suspicion. Under Riina, Cosa Nostra had been too loud. Provenzano knew survival now required the opposite, to disappear. So began the long era of silence. Provenzano ruled not with speeches or grand meetings, but with pizzini, tiny scraps of paper folded neatly, passed from hand to hand by trusted couriers. On these notes, often no larger than the palm of a hand, he would write his orders in careful, cryptic script. Sometimes they were simple instructions about contracts or alliances. Sometimes they carried advice about family disputes or guidance on who should be trusted and who should be cut away. Rarely did they contain threats. Always they were signed with code names or symbols, never his own. The ritual of the pizzini became the heartbeat of his empire. Unlike Riina, Provenzano never summoned underlings to stand before him. He never risked wiretaps, never gave the police a voice to trace. His couriers moved silently through the Sicilian countryside, slipping envelopes into the hands of men who bowed their heads, reading orders as though receiving commandments from a ghost. He had become, in every sense, the invisible hand. Provenzano's genius lay in patience. He understood that violence, though intoxicating to men like Riina, was unsustainable. Too much blood invited too much attention, and attention was death. Under his watch, Cosa Nostra abandoned the spectacle of terror. No more judges murdered on highways. No more bombs in the heart of Palermo. Instead, the mafia slid back into the shadows, embedding itself in contracts for construction, agriculture, waste management. It seeped into politics quietly, exchanging favors instead of bullets, investing profits not in fear but in cement and influence. The strategy worked. As the Italian state celebrated Riina's downfall, they believed the war was won. Meanwhile, Provenzano was building something far more enduring, a mafia that looked less like an army and more like an institution. Ordinary Sicilians felt the difference. The silence was disorienting. Where once the city had trembled at explosions, now there was nothing. A strange stillness settled over the island. Some believed the mafia had finally loosened its grip. But in truth, Provenzano had simply shifted the battlefield. The war was no longer fought in alleys or piazzas. It was fought in council chambers, in the awarding of public contracts, in the quiet exchange of envelopes across polished desks. It was here, in the spaces where ordinary eyes could not see, that Provenzano thrived. For nearly a decade after Riina's arrest, Provenzano was more rumor than man. He did not appear in public, did not allow himself to be photographed, did not even permit most of his closest allies to hear his voice. To many, he became a myth, an old story whispered over espresso in Palermo cafes, a name carried in cautious tones. Children of mafia families grew up never seeing him, never hearing him, yet obeying him all the same. His absence was his armor. To catch Riina, the state had needed to map his movements, to place him in rooms, to tie him to conversations. Provenzano gave them nothing. He became the ghost at the edge of Sicily's consciousness, a shadow without a face. This invisibility was not cowardice, it was strategy. By erasing himself from view, Provenzano made the mafia itself harder to see. Journalists searching for blood could find none. Police listening for gunfire heard only silence. And in that silence, Cosa Nostra endured, reshaped, and in some ways strengthened. But invisibility carries its own kind of terror. For those who lived under Provenzano's reign, fear became quieter but more suffocating. No one knew where the orders came from, only that they came. A businessman might win a lucrative contract and suspect unseen strings were pulling in his favor. A rival might suddenly find his resources drained, his allies vanishing, without ever knowing which unseen hand had turned against him. Provenzano's mafia did not roar, it whispered, and whispers are harder to fight. In Sicily's small towns, people adjusted. They stopped looking for the mafia in gunfights and explosions. Instead, they learned to recognize it in the sudden appearance of construction cranes, in the quiet reshuffling of political candidates, In the subtle ways money flowed through communities. Provenzano had made Cosa Nostra less visible, yes, but in doing so, he had made it inescapable. The years stretched on. Provenzano aged in silence, his body weakening but his influence deepening. He lived as a fugitive, always hidden, often in shepherds' huts or remote farmhouses, but he never surrendered control. His life was one of deliberate obscurity, worn clothes, simple meals, stacks of newspapers folded beside his bed. There was nothing glamorous about him, nothing theatrical. Yet in his hands, the mafia became a system as natural as the Sicilian sun. It was this transformation from spectacle to silence that ensured Cosa Nostra's survival. Where Riina had burned too hot, Provenzano cooled the flames. Where Riina had sought to dominate through terror, Provenzano chose to govern through absence. He was not the face of fear, but its void. And in that void, his power grew stronger than fire and blood could ever achieve. By the end of the 1990s, Sicily stood under a peculiar calm. The bombs were gone, the blood less visible. But beneath the quiet streets and shimmering coastlines, the mafia pulsed stronger than ever. Invisible, untouchable, eternal. And at the center of it all, silent, unseen, and patiently watching, was Bernardo Provenzano. The invisible hand. Power, when exercised with violence, leaves marks that the world cannot ignore. But power expressed in silence, through signatures on paper, handshakes behind closed doors, and whispers carried from office to office, can be far more dangerous. After Riina's bloody reign collapsed with his arrest, Sicily seemed to exhale, relieved that the storm had passed. But in the shadows, Bernardo Provenzano had already begun weaving a quieter, more enduring empire. He understood something that Riina never could: terror has limits. Bombs and bullets provoke fury. They awaken resistance. But silence, patience, and money, those are infinite. They slip beneath the skin of society like a slow poison, unnoticed until it is too late. In the 1990s, Sicily was transforming. Construction cranes stretched toward the blue Mediterranean sky, roads wound through the island's hills, and government funds poured into public works. To ordinary eyes, it looked like progress, but to Provenzano, it was opportunity. His men infiltrated every stage of these projects. They bought politicians who could unlock funding. They installed allies in municipal offices to approve contracts. They intimidated or killed the businessmen who dared to resist, replacing them with pliable figures. Soon, entire industries, construction, agriculture, waste management, were entangled in his invisible web. And yet Provenzano himself was nowhere to be seen. He never attended the meetings where decisions were made. He never spoke into telephones, never appeared in photographs. His commands arrived in the form of pizzini, small, handwritten notes folded into squares and delivered by trusted couriers. Each note carried instructions in his spidery handwriting, littered with biblical references and coded phrases. It was as though he existed only in ink, a ghost communicating from some unseen realm. For law enforcement, this absence was maddening. Police raids stormed farmhouses and villas where they believed he might be hiding. Each time they found traces: an unmade bed, half-eaten food, a discarded newspaper. It was proof that Provenzano had been there just hours before, but had already dissolved back into the landscape. He had become the ghost of Corleone, a presence that haunted the island without ever being touched. The frustration of prosecutors was palpable. They knew he controlled billions, that his reach extended from Sicily to Rome, even to financial markets abroad. But how do you prosecute a shadow? How do you arrest a man who lives not in the spotlight of violence, but in the twilight of bureaucracy and backroom deals? Journalists described his rule as a spider's web, thin, fragile-looking, almost invisible. But every thread was connected. Tug at one, and vibrations ran across the entire structure. He didn't need to roar like Riina. He didn't need to make threats in the open. His power lay in stillness, in patience, in the quiet certainty that he would outlast anyone foolish enough to challenge him. Imagine the corridors of a government building in Palermo, lined with dusty filing cabinets. Behind one locked door, a civil servant signs off on a contract that will funnel millions into mafia-controlled companies. He knows whose interests he is serving, though he has never met Provenzano. In another office, a politician makes a phone call, steering funds toward a construction project guaranteed to enrich the invisible empire. These men are not soldiers in the traditional sense. They wear suits, carry briefcases, and attend ribbon-cutting ceremonies. And yet, their loyalty to Provenzano is as binding as any oath sworn in blood. For the ordinary citizen, life carried on. Shops opened each morning, children walked to school, tourists strolled along the beaches. Sicily's beauty, the lemon groves, the glittering coastlines, the winding cobblestone streets, remained untouched. But beneath this surface, money flowed in unseen currents, pulled by Provenzano's steady hand. The terror of car bombs and assassinations had faded, replaced by something subtler, more insidious. A society where the mafia was not an intruder but a silent partner, woven into the fabric of daily life. Some Sicilians whispered of this invisible rule. Others denied it, preferring not to see the threads that held their world together. And many, worn down by decades of violence, welcomed the change. If Provenzano's reign meant fewer bodies in the streets, fewer funerals for judges and journalists, perhaps silence was a blessing. In this way, he earned not love but tolerance, a grudging acceptance that his ghostly presence was better than the chaos of the past. Law enforcement, however, could not afford to look away. Year after year, they tightened their search. Surveillance teams camped in the hills, watching farmhouses through binoculars. Informants whispered of sightings, but Provenzano had mastered the art of vanishing. He moved through the countryside like a rumor, always one step ahead, always just out of reach. His couriers carried not just messages but also his invisibility, shielding him from the eyes of the state. The psychological weight of this pursuit was immense. To hunt a man who leaves no trace is to chase a phantom. Each failed raid, each empty room, deepened the sense that he was untouchable, that the law was powerless against a ghost. For prosecutors who had seen their colleagues assassinated in earlier years, the frustration was sharpened by grief. They longed for justice, but justice seemed always to slip through their fingers, as if Provenzano himself were time, unstoppable, relentless, patient. By the late 1990s, his empire stretched across Italy, intertwined with businesses that appeared legitimate to outsiders. The boundary between the lawful and the criminal blurred until it was indistinguishable. Was the contractor building a new highway simply a businessman, or was he part of Cosa Nostra's network? Was the politician in Rome a servant of the people, or a silent partner in Provenzano's empire? The uncertainty itself was a victory, for it bred paralysis. Who could fight an enemy when you could no longer see where he ended, and society began? The metaphor of the web is fitting not only because it captures the delicacy of his design, but also the dread it inspires. A web is beautiful in its geometry, shimmering in the morning light. But for the creature caught within it, the web is death, inevitable and unseen until it is too late. Provenzano had woven such a web across Sicily and beyond, and those trapped within it often didn't even realize their entanglement until escape was impossible. By the dawn of the new millennium, Provenzano's legend had only grown. He had become a myth, a whisper in the markets, a rumor in the countryside, a shadow stretching from Corleone to the capital. For the state, the chase continued. For the people, life went on. And for Provenzano himself, hidden in silence, time remained his greatest weapon. Each passing year only tightened the threads of his web, binding Sicily ever closer to the ghost who ruled it unseen. For 43 years, the Italian state searched for a man who was everywhere and nowhere at once. Bernardo Provenzano, the quiet lord of shadows, had become more myth than flesh. To the press, he was Il Fantasma di Corleone, the ghost. To investigators, he was the one case that haunted their careers, the one name they pinned above their desks with the knowledge that catching him might never come. The manhunt began in earnest after Riina's fall in 1993. With the Corleone's brutal king in prison, law enforcement assumed the remaining bosses would be easier to flush out. But Provenzano was not Riina. He did not call meetings in grand villas, nor walk openly among his soldiers. He receded into the Sicilian countryside, shedding identity like a snake discards its skin, and in doing so, he became untouchable. Detectives worked in smoke-filled offices, hunched over maps of Sicily. Red pins dotted Palermo, Agrigento, Caltanissetta. Files stacked high on metal cabinets told the same story. Raids conducted, doors broken down, fields combed, shepherds' huts searched. Each time they arrived to find nothing. A plate still warm from a meal, a bed recently slept in, the faint smell of tobacco lingering in the air. Provenzano was always one step ahead, as though someone whispered into his ear seconds before the police came knocking. The frustration gnawed at investigators. Some began to believe the whispers, that Provenzano had died years ago, his legend kept alive by loyalists who used his name to rule. Others thought he had fled abroad, perhaps hiding among Sicilian immigrés in America or South America. Yet no evidence supported these theories. Instead, like a patient hunter, Provenzano left just enough trace to remind them he was still there, alive, watching. The key to his survival was discipline. He refused to use telephones, knowing wiretaps had destroyed so many of his peers. He shunned photographs. No new image of him surfaced after the 1960s. When men needed his orders, they received them not through meetings but through the tiny scraps of paper he trusted, Pizzini. These notes, handwritten in block letters to obscure his style, were delivered by couriers who risked everything to keep the chain unbroken. It was a system designed to be invisible, each link dissolving into the landscape like Provenzano himself. He lived simply, almost primitively. For years, he is believed to have moved between rustic cottages, abandoned farmhouses, and shepherds' huts high in the Sicilian hills. He dressed as a peasant, ate as a peasant, and carried himself with the humility of a man who knew that survival was not about strength but invisibility. To blend into Sicily was to disappear, for the island itself was a labyrinth of stone villages and winding paths that resisted intrusion. Yet Provenzano's invisibility came at a price. The silence that protected him also meant isolation. He did not walk the streets of Palermo, did not embrace friends in public, did not taste the open air of freedom in the way ordinary men did. He existed in rooms with drawn shutters, surrounded by dust, the tick of clocks, and the muted shuffling of trusted companions. His empire thrived in his absence, but he himself lived as a prisoner of his own caution. For law enforcement, the chase took on a psychological weight. They studied his habits, his family ties, the whispers of doctors who treated old men in remote villages. They tapped into the web of couriers, but each time the threads dissolved before they could reach the center. Provenzano seemed to anticipate every move, as though he could see the state's hand before it was played. The offices of Palermo's anti-mafia task force became places of fatigue and obsession. Cigarette smoke hung like a fog over desks cluttered with files. Late at night, men in wrinkled shirts stared at photographs from the 1960s, trying to imagine how the ghost might look now. Would his face have grown heavy with age? Would illness have bent his spine? Or was he still strong, hidden behind a farmer's stoop and weathered skin? The hunt felt endless. Decades passed, governments changed, younger investigators inherited the files of their predecessors. To pursue Provenzano was to inherit a burden. Some resigned in frustration. Others persevered, convinced that the ghost was mortal, that time would eventually betray him. And in the early 2000s, whispers began to change. Provenzano, it was said, was unwell. Cancer, perhaps, an infection, something that required treatment. If true, it was his greatest weakness. For even ghosts must reach for medicine. Even phantoms must bleed. The break came from the very system that had long sustained him. The Pizzini, those scraps of paper that carried his empire, were intercepted. Police found one, then another, coded messages that hinted at his location and his declining health. The web, so carefully spun, had begun to unravel. Still, it was not easy. Each clue led to days of surveillance, weeks of dead ends, a house raided too late, a barn searched only to find silence. But the investigators refused to surrender. They moved with the same patience Provenzano had once perfected. They learned to wait. The image of the hunt became one of two forces locked in a long, silent duel. On one side, the ghost, a man who had spent a lifetime hiding among stone walls and shadows. On the other, the state, weary but unrelenting, inching forward with every intercepted note, every whispered rumor of illness. By the end of this chapter of the hunt, the net was tightening. Provenzano was no longer the untouchable phantom he had been for decades. His silence, his greatest weapon, was betraying him. The ghost was leaving a trace, faint but undeniable. And somewhere in the Sicilian hills, the last chapter of his freedom was beginning to close. The morning of April 11, 2006, began like any other in the rolling countryside near Corleone. The fields stretched wide and green beneath a pale Sicilian sky, their stillness broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional bark of a distant dog. It was in this unremarkable silence that one of the most extraordinary moments in Italian history would unfold. The end of a 43-year pursuit, the unraveling of a legend that had haunted a nation for generations. Police moved before dawn. Carabinieri units and elite anti-mafia officers spread quietly across the countryside, their boots pressing into damp earth, radios whispering clipped commands. From above, helicopters circled in long, deliberate arcs, their rotors slicing the air. The farmhouse they surrounded was modest, a weather-worn stone structure nestled at the edge of an olive grove. To anyone else, it might have looked like the home of a poor farmer, perhaps a shepherd who had grown old in solitude. But to the officers who crept closer, weapons ready but heart steady, it was the lair of a ghost. Inside, the man they sought was not packing like a cornered beast. He was not armed. He was not waiting with fury in his eyes or vengeance in his fists. Instead, Bernardo Provenzano, once the most elusive and feared boss in Sicily, sat quietly at his table as though time had finally folded him into itself. His hair was thin and gray, his body frail from age and illness. A typewriter rested beside him, its keys worn smooth from decades of use. Nearby, stacks of pizzini lay carefully organized, tiny squares of paper carrying his orders, his empire reduced to whispered words scratched in ink. The officers stormed the house with practiced precision, doors kicked open, rifles raised. But what they found disarmed them more than any ambush could. Provenzano did not fight. He did not run. He simply looked up, eyes weary but calm, as if he had always known this moment would come. There was no defiance, no final act of resistance. Only surrender, not to men but to inevitability. News of his arrest spread like wildfire, rippling across Italy and beyond. Television screens filled with the image of police cars streaming down narrow Sicilian roads, lights flashing against centuries-old stone. Crowds gathered in Palermo and Rome, journalists swarmed, and voices rose in disbelief. For decades, the story of Provenzano had grown so large, so mythic, that many had doubted he was even alive. Some believed he had escaped overseas. Others whispered that he had died years earlier and been buried in secret. But now, here he was, not a phantom, but a fragile old man escorted into daylight. The irony was sharp, almost cruel. Provenzano, the ghost who had once ruled an empire of silence, who had outwitted police, prosecutors, and politicians alike, was carried out of a farmhouse like a tired grandfather. His reign had ended not with a bang, not with the roar of bombs or the flash of gunfire, but with the slow erosion of time. The myth had collapsed into flesh, and flesh had weakened. For law enforcement, the moment was triumphant, but it carried a strange weight. In the offices where detectives had stared at maps dotted with red pins, in the interrogation rooms where men had whispered his name with fear, in the sleepless nights of investigators chasing shadows, this was the victory they had longed for. Yet when they looked upon him, bent and diminished, it was not rage that filled them, but something closer to melancholy. Because Provenzano's capture was more than the fall of a man, It was the closing of a chapter in Sicily's long, bloody struggle with its own darkness. For the families who had buried sons and brothers, for the judges and policemen killed in the years of fire, the moment carried relief, yes, but no true justice. No prison cell could restore the lives already lost. No set of handcuffs could undo the decades of fear. The farmhouse itself became a symbol, a place frozen in time. Investigators combed through the rooms, collecting every scrap of paper, every typewritten note. They found coded messages written in Provenzano's hand, some addressed to allies still loyal to him, others filled with instructions about contracts, payments, alliances. The empire he had maintained from this modest home was revealed to be vast, intricate, and eerily quiet. He had not needed guns or bombs to keep control. He had needed only patience, a network of couriers, and the discipline to remain invisible. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Sicily, the image of Provenzano being led away entered the collective memory of Italy. He shuffled slowly, flanked by officers in black uniforms, his face half-shadowed by age. For those watching, it was difficult to reconcile this figure with the monster who had once orchestrated bloodshed, who had ordered deaths with the press of a typewriter key. Time had stripped away the aura of menace, leaving behind only a shell of a man who had lived too long in the company of silence. And yet beneath the frailty, something persisted. Perhaps it was the knowledge that even in capture he had outlasted almost all who had opposed him. Riina was gone, the old guard of Corleone scattered or dead, but Provenzano had endured. He had lived to see his enemies buried, lived to watch the world forget him, lived until the myth itself began to fade. His arrest marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a reckoning. Italy would never again see a boss like him, so cautious, so ghost-like, so thoroughly committed to vanishing into the folds of the land. His empire would unravel, but the memory of his methods, his silence, would linger as a warning. Power need not be loud to be absolute. As the farmhouse lights flickered off that night and the countryside fell back into darkness, Sicily seemed to exhale. The ghost of Corleone had been caught, but in the hush that followed, one could not help but wonder, was this truly justice, or merely the natural conclusion of time's slow hunt? For in the end, Bernardo Provenzano had been undone not by betrayal or violence, but by the one force even he could not outwit, the quiet, patient passing of years. In the dim corridors of Italy's prison hospitals, silence hangs heavier than chains. Here, among sterile walls and fluorescent lights, Bernardo Provenzano, the ghost of Corleone, the once invisible architect of Cosa Nostra, lived out his final years. It was a strange epilogue for a man who had built an empire on shadows and whispers. Once, his very name had been enough to bend men's wills, to terrify mayors and silence judges. Now, he was simply an old man with failing organs, carried on stretchers and confined to a hospital bed. The feared tractor, who had crushed enemies beneath his relentless will, had been reduced to a frail figure of flesh and bone. His prison cell was not one of iron bars and echoing footsteps, but a ward, watched constantly by guards. Surveillance cameras recorded even his shallow breaths. His body, ravaged by illness, betrayed him slowly. Parkinson's disease gnawed at his muscles, leaving his hands trembling. Dementia eroded his mind, peeling away memories like old paint on abandoned walls. The voice that once issued careful orders through coded letters was now a whisper, often incoherent. For a man who had lived in silence, silence became his prison. There was no throne, no council of capos at his bedside. The network he had woven so patiently began to fray in his absence. Younger bosses, raised in the shadow of his invisible empire, sought to emulate his methods but lacked his patience. Cosa Nostra survived him, but it was no longer the same. Provenzano's brand of power, quiet, disciplined, almost ascetic, died with him, leaving behind a mafia more fragmented, more desperate, less sure of itself. He had crafted a system where time was the greatest weapon, but time was also the one enemy he could not outwit. The guards who watched him did not see a legendary mastermind. They saw an old man, at times muttering to himself, at times staring blankly at the ceiling. For them, the myth seemed almost absurd. This fragile body, connected to IV drips, was the same figure who had evaded capture for 43 years. This man, who now required nurses to feed him, had once bent the state of Italy to his will. The contrast was almost unbearable. But memory is stubborn, and myth lingers even when flesh dissolves. Outside those hospital walls, Provenzano's name still carried echoes. Families who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons to mafia violence still whispered of him with bitterness. Investigators who had spent decades chasing his ghost still felt the sting of unfinished justice. His imprisonment was real, his body confined, but the damage he had wrought lingered like a sickness in the air of Sicily. It was justice, but it was also futility. What could it mean to imprison a man at the edge of death? What solace could be given to families who had waited generations for answers? What satisfaction could come from watching the ghost fade into decrepitude, his empire intact in fragments, his legend untouched by bars? To see Provenzano alive yet diminished was to confront the paradox of justice itself, necessary but never enough. His silence, once his greatest weapon, remained with him until the end. In prison, he refused to cooperate with investigators. No confessions, no betrayals, no final revelations. Even as his mind unraveled, his instinct to keep secrets held firm. The Pizzini had stopped, but their spirit lived in the stillness of his last years. He had built a life upon silence, and silence accompanied him into death. Yet for law enforcement, for historians, for those who had fought the mafia for decades, his capture and imprisonment still carried weight. It was proof that even the most elusive fugitive could be found. It was proof that myths could be stripped down to human form. And still, there was a melancholy in the ending. Provenzano had denied his enemies the satisfaction of a dramatic downfall. There were no explosive revelations, no trials filled with testimony, no final act of defiance. Just a gradual fading, like smoke thinning into air. In July 2016, the ghost of Corleone finally dissolved into history. He died in his hospital ward at the age of 83, under the same strict surveillance that had accompanied his imprisonment. Guards stood watch even in his final moments, as though afraid he might escape death itself. But there was no escape. For all his discipline, his patience, his uncanny ability to vanish into landscapes and live as a phantom, Provenzano could not hide from mortality. His death brought a strange quiet to Sicily. There were no grand funerals, no public ceremonies. Even in death, he was kept under the state's heavy hand. Fearing that his burial might become a rallying point for mafia loyalists, the authorities restricted the service, allowing no fanfare. The man who had ruled through shadows was lowered into the earth with only whispers above his grave. But like any ghost, he left traces. The mafia he shaped had adapted. It had learned from his methods, how to move invisibly, how to corrupt silently, how to weave influence into the very fabric of society. Though the headlines declared the death of a boss, his lessons in patience and silence lived on. Younger generations of Cosa Nostra understood that Provenzano had shown them a blueprint, not through violence but through invisibility. For Sicily, his life and death remain a bitter parable. That true power often does not roar, it whispers. That silence can be as destructive as bombs. That justice, when delayed for decades, is never whole. In the end, Provenzano's story is not one of triumph or defeat, but of inevitability. A man who lived like a phantom, evaded capture for generations, and finally withered into an old man in a cell. The ghost was gone, but the shadows he left remained. Sicily has always been a land of contradictions. It is a place where golden light spills over rolling hills, where olive groves breathe in the sea's salted wind, and where Baroque churches rise proudly above crumbling alleyways. It is also a place where silence has often spoken louder than words, where fear has seeped into generations, and where shadows have long claimed dominion over the living. For decades, that silence bore the weight of one man, Bernardo Provenzano, the ghost who turned invisibility into power. Now, with his death in 2016, the question that lingers is not about his crimes or even his capture, but about what remains after the ghost has faded. The story does not end with his cell door closing. It continues in the whispers of Sicilian families, in the half-shuttered windows of Corleone, in the way children once learned to keep their voices low when strangers asked questions. Provenzano's reign was not about the spectacle of blood, as his predecessor Todo Riina's had been. It was about something subtler, something more enduring, the psychology of silence. In Sicily, silence became both shield and prison. It protected those who aligned with power and condemned those who dared to resist. The Mafia's code of omerta thrived because of men like Provenzano, who understood that the most effective chains are not forged from iron, but from fear. Yet silence also has a strange kind of endurance. It seeps into the fabric of a culture until it becomes invisible. Long after Provenzano was confined to his prison bed, his lessons remained. Young mafiosi learned that survival did not come from gunfire or flamboyance but from restraint. They inherited a quieter mafia, one less visible, less dramatic, but no less insidious. Walk through Palermo today and you will find streets alive with tourists, cafes spilling laughter into the night, and art students sketching among ancient ruins. Yet beneath the ordinary, beneath the beauty, there are still whispers of those shadows. The mafia has not disappeared. It has shifted, adapted, hidden, just as Provenzano did for more than 40 years. He taught them invisibility, and invisibility endures. But Sicily is also more than its ghosts. The same land that gave rise to Provenzano has also given rise to defiance. Journalists, judges, teachers, and ordinary citizens have challenged the culture of fear. Some paid with their lives. Others continue the struggle, insisting that silence can be broken, that shadows can be pierced. In this way, Provenzano's legacy is double-edged. He represents the endurance of silence, but also the persistence of resistance. His ghost lingers not just as a figure of fear, but as a reminder of what must be overcome. Perhaps the truest lesson of Provenzano's life is that real power rarely announces itself. It moves quietly, patiently, shaping destinies without spectacle. He showed that control can be exercised not with gunfire in the streets, but with a slip of paper, a coded pizzino, passed hand to hand. His typewriter was mightier than the rifle, his silence louder than the roar of bombs. And yet what did it leave behind? Families broken, generations scarred, trust corroded, an island whose beauty has often been shadowed by its fear. The hills of Corleone are still there, green in spring, dry and golden in summer. The old farmhouses where Provenzano once hid have returned to their silence, their stone walls holding memories only the wind recalls. His empire is gone, fragmented by arrests, by betrayals, by time itself. What remains is less tangible. The atmosphere he created, the echoes of silence that shaped the psychology of a people. It is tempting to see Provenzano as merely a villain, and in many ways he was. But he was also a mirror. He reflected back the weaknesses of a society that allowed him to thrive. The fear of speaking, the hesitation to confront, the habit of looking away. In that mirror, Sicily, and indeed the world, must recognize itself. Because Provenzano's silence was not unique to the mafia. Every society has its shadows, its silences that protect power and punish truth. Whether in politics, business, or daily life, the lesson is the same. Silence is fertile ground for corruption. It allows ghosts to rule. As this story closes, we are left not with the image of the young tractor cutting through enemies, nor of the frail old man in a prison bed. Instead, we are left with Sicily itself. The sunlit fields, the villages where shutters close at dusk, the voices that tremble between fear and defiance. The ghost is gone, his body lies buried, his empire is fractured, but silence remains. It lingers in the pause before a name is spoken, in the hesitation before truth is told. It reminds us that the most dangerous power is not always the one we see, but the one that moves unseen, unquestioned, unspoken. And yet silence is not eternal. It can be broken. Every story told, every memory preserved, every truth spoken aloud is an act against the ghost's legacy. In telling his story now, in tracing the long arc of his shadow, we do not honor him. We expose him. We drag the ghost into the light where he can no longer hide. As night falls over Sicily, the hills darken, the villages quiet. Somewhere, a typewriter gathers dust, its keys silent, its messages unread. The echo of Provenzano's life is fading, yet the silence he mastered still drifts through the corridors of power. It is a silence that warns. It is a silence that teaches. It is a silence that demands to be remembered, so it can finally be broken. The story of the ghost is over, but the echoes of silence remain.